right here. Okay, good. All right, we're all set.
This one is like
You can use that to move around.
So I don't have to use this button anymore. Okay.
No more buttons.
Treating yourself correctly.
Dan H, may I have a few minutes to begin? We're starting something new.
No, not the mine. Mine's just like how like in this one they like keep the collective dinosaur away from the dinosaur, and then like this one is just like how like you treat it how.
Okay, we're starting a new section. We're moving into the material of the New Testament. And there's a common session, there's a plenary session on Friday, okay, about this as we move into this. I'm sorry I haven't posted the thing on the thing, but but I want a few introductory comments here about the New Testament material. We are starting with Acts, chronologically speaking. Acts is one of the last works that appears in the New Testament, right? So just to give you where these documents that we're going to be examining and exploring now concern the life of Jesus, a character, a person for which there is evidence, contested evidence about his historical reality, his historical identity. Most of what we know about this figure comes from the writings in the New Testament. There have been attempts to find corroborating evidence outside of the New Testament with more or less success. If Jesus was a historical character, he appears to have lived approximately 4 to 30 or so CE, somewhere in that range, right? It aligns with the other historical evidence that we see in that appear in the historical evidence that appears in these writings. The very first documents of the New Testament, in terms of the dates of their composition, are the letters of Paul. After the letters, and they date from approximately 45 CE until about 60 CE. Right? So we're talking about, at least according to them, probably almost 20 years. They begin almost 20 years after the life of this person, this Jesus that is the focal point of this movement. So Paul's letters are the very first ones, and I want to just say a little bit something about this, is that the legacy of Jesus, of this figure, was contested among a variety of groups at this particular time. There were those who belonged to his immediate family, and we get some evidence of that in the letters. There were those who exerted or claimed authority for the legacy of Jesus and this movement, who were among his disciples, the so-called disciples, the people that worked with him most immediately. So we have family members who had some claim to the authority of this legacy, as we would today. The descendants of a historical person have some claim to the legacy. His immediate friends, the circle, the people that he spent time with, as depicted in these documents, also staked a claim or claimed some authority to the legacy of this person in this movement. And then Paul staked a claim of authority for this particular movement. And there were there is evidence in these documents that this was contested among these groups. Christianity, as we know it today, is primarily, almost exclusively Pauline. That Paul's version of the Jesus movement and what he did to promote his version of the Jesus movement is the one that has predominated over the others. The documents that we have reflect some of these conflicts. John is one of the most interesting documents that found its way into the so-called canon, into this set of documents that are in the New Testament, and it's because it comes from even a slightly different so-called Johannine school. That is another area, another way of interpreting this material that is loosely grouped within what are called the Gnostic movement, where they view Jesus and the Jesus movement even somewhat differently. So in these documents we see that we have, there are at least 4 distinct versions of Jesus and the Jesus movement. Those related to his family, those related to the disciples, the people that his immediate circle while he was alive, those concerning Paul's version and interpretation of the Jesus movement, and those connected with the Johannine, or the school related to the writings of John, which are essentially Gnostic in their nature. With the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library and the Qumran findings, we know that there were other communities as well that embraced in one way or another this legacy. So these 4 are not exclusive historically, although we will deal almost primarily with Paul's version of the Jesus movement. We are therefore going to follow approximately the chronologically through these materials, and we're going to start with Paul's letters. We're starting, however, with Acts, which is actually one of the latest, probably written sometime, certainly after Luke, and most scholars put Luke at between 85 and 95 CE. So we're talking pretty much towards the end of the 1st century CE. It is late. It is an interpretation that is fairly significantly Pauline. It justifies Paul's approach to it. It is written, of course, all of the names that are attached to these letters, with the exception of Paul, are contested. Matthew, Luke, Mark, all of these are contested. They are names that were attached to these documents significantly later. It's certainly in the 2nd century CE. So the actual authorship of these is unknown for the most part, except for the letters of Paul. So we would normally begin with the letters of Paul, probably with Galatians actually, which was one of the first, but Acts provides a historical sort of framework for Paul and the letters, and so we're starting with that. So it's not chronologically the first place to start, but it is I think it's a good starting place because it maps out for us what led to the creation of Paul's version of the Jesus movement. The so-called Gospels, which are really mini biographies of Jesus, are written in response to the demands or what is happening in these various communities that emerged from the Jesus movement. As they tried to figure out what this movement meant and how these communities are supposed to understand Jesus and this movement, they went back and they sort of recreated or collected stories about Jesus so that they could go back and sort of explain what is it that Jesus did, what did he say, what did he do, how are we supposed to interpret what he said and did in some sort of philosophy, some sort of way of life. And so they went back. And so you will see that John views the life of Jesus and the Jesus movement in a very different way than the others. That Matthew clearly is writing from a pro-Paul perspective. He is the one that is if we read it, we will see that it best supports or more vigorously promotes the Pauline agenda. We'll see that Mark is probably the least. It's sort of the most vanilla. It's the one that seems to be oldest, perhaps, and that Luke is really takes the perspective also very much in the Pauline thing, but also situates it within the social and political context of the 1st and 2nd century CE. Right? Okay, all of that to say, it's a little bit of background to explain how we're going about this and how we're doing it. Okay, now I would venture to guess, I don't know for sure, but I would venture to guess that many of you have had experience in a Christian context of one sort or another, perhaps as a church growing up, a school, or something. And our country thinks of itself as oriented towards the Christian. Certainly those who were Christians were instrumental in the foundation of the political system that we now have. And so, not that they were necessarily Christians themselves, the so-called founding fathers, but it was strongly influenced by the Jesus movement and the New Testament, which is why actually we are sitting in this class. Okay, it is because the Walter Bellingraf and his wife felt like, in order to be a part of this country, that we needed to understand, have a academically sound and comprehensive study of the Bible, and I certainly embrace that idea. I do think that these documents are incredibly important for understanding our culture. I do believe that we need to situate them in their historical and cultural contexts, which is why we surround them with the other things that are happening in the Mediterranean and Middle East and Northern Africa. But I think it's important to understand these, and so we do want to understand them, and we will approach them from a strictly secular perspective. These are documents that have helped shape the culture that we inhabit, but we are not approaching them with the notion that they represent some sort of metaphysical truth, right? Now, this may run contrary to your beliefs. Some of you may believe that these truly are scriptures, that they are inspired of some divine force, and that they have some relevance to our existence both in this world and in some afterlife. And I recognize that, I respect that, and I celebrate those feelings or those perspectives of faith that you may have individually. But in this room and in this conversation, we are going to look at them as historical documents, and we're going to understand them as such and not as sacred texts. We understand their sacredness for certain populations, but for us, as we talk about them, they are like all of the other documents that we've examined. Some might feel very, very strongly about, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Certainly, at certain times, those were as viewed as sacred as the New Testament is for populations today. But we don't think of them, and we examine them for their cultural relevance, not for their religious perspectives. And we understand and we talk. So it will be a little bit different, because when we were looking at the Hebrew Bible, we understood that the dominant supernatural or divine figure in those was Yahweh, right? Now it's a little bit more complicated. And it's complicated because of this Jesus and who Jesus, at least according to these documents, claimed he was, and his relationship to Yahweh. Yahweh, remember that Jesus, based on the documents that we have, was a Jew, right? And he embraced and lived the Jewish life according to the law of Moses as he understood it. He was Jewish, right? And so his relationship as a Jew to Judaism is something that's going to animate this as we examine this sort of thing. So Yahweh was a reality for Jesus as well as it was for those around him and who participated in the Jesus movement. So Yahweh, we will continue to refer to this divinity that was the divinity of the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, the Israelites, as Yahweh. How we refer to Jesus is a contested thing. We can call him Jesus, and I would prefer that we refer to it as Jesus. Christos is a term, it's a Greek term, and it means the anointed one. Okay? And that certainly comes from a religious perspective. When we refer to Paul, we are not calling him Saint Paul, because that affixes to his identity, even though he is viewed as a saint in a number of religious circles. We're going to talk about him as Paul. And when we get to Augustine, we're going to refer to Augustine not as Saint Augustine, but as Augustine, because he was a formative intellect and important person in the evolution of Christian theology. But for us, he's not a saint, okay? He's just a regular person, okay? Does that make sense to you? I don't want to be offensive to anyone. I certainly respect religious views that you might have. But here, we're going to examine these as cultural and historical documents and try to understand them as such. Now, what that also means is that I want and I encourage us to look at these as they are, not as they have been interpreted in the subsequent centuries and millennia, right? So the whole notion of a trinity, the whole notion of omniscience and omnipotence, all of these things are intellectual ideas and theological constructs that come after this. What we're really looking at is the creation of communities based on the teachings, the actions of this individual that we'll call Jesus, right? And what we're really going to be looking at is Paul's version of the Jesus movement. And there's some, and I want at the outset, and I'm sorry for taking so long, at the outset to remind you about certain aspects of the Pauline movement, right? Which will explain, which will help us to understand some of the things that we see in these documents, okay? First of all, Paul believed that Jesus was going to return imminently. He does not say that it's going to be in a week or a month or 2 months or 3 months or a year or something, but he fervently believed that Jesus was going to come back and that his return was going to completely transform the political, social system as we understand it. And so many of the ideas that emerge from his letters having to do with the followers' relationship to each other, their followers' relationship to the state, to their occupations, to all of that sort of thing his ideas are based on the notion that there's an imminent transformation, an imminent upheaval of what was existing at the time. This is also one of the reasons why this movement clashed with the Roman system, with the empirical, bureaucratic political system that essentially shaped the lives of the people that Paul is interacting with. If there's going to be complete social transformation in a matter of weeks, maybe, or months at the most, then the whole notion that one is a slave or a freedman or an emperor or a consul or a quaestor, any of that sort of thing is, for Paul and his community, meaningless. Sell everything that you have and get ready, because it's going to come and you're going to want to be on the right side of this social transformation. If you're thinking about getting married, don't, okay? Because this social transformation is going to affect everything. You know, it's going to affect families, interpersonal relationships, familial relationships, the relationships of clientela, okay, who is the relationship to one's patron, and for patrons, their relationship with their clientes. It's going to change everything. We just have to now think about what's imminent, what's going to happen, and we need to prepare ourselves. And so this was viewed by the Roman authorities as, reasonably so, I believe, as a threat to the social system. These followers of Jesus were congregating, which in and of itself was prohibited in the Roman world. So free association, as we know it today, was something that the Romans frowned upon, and it was only possible under certain circumstances. They had no respect for the social stratification in society. So it represented a significant threat, not early on because it was very small communities, and it was also related to the Jewish communities, which had always kind of operated independently of the regular social system, and the Romans were quite tolerant, as we know, and ecumenical in terms of religious ideas, and so the Jews, for the most part, were allowed to celebrate their religious ideas as long as it didn't represent a threat to the social and political system of the Roman Empire. It's fine. This movement is picking up steam, and just to spoiler alert, okay, Constantine, 3 centuries later, okay, is going to, as this movement picks up as the number of followers increase and as this movement becomes more and more significant, Constantine sees it as a way ultimately to unify a very far-flung and disparate empire, and then sees in the Jesus movement an opportunity for political advancement, to solidify and to essentially create a common experience, not unlike that Augustus had created from generations of civil war in the 1st century CE. And so that's how Christianity becomes ultimately in Constantine's hands. It becomes a tool for him to solidify political control over a very far-flung, increasingly pluralistic and diverse population. Christianity, as we will see, has a little bit for everything. Okay, it is an amalgamation of ideas, including those from the Hebrew world, those from the Manichaeanism and Zoroastrianism from further east, from Hellenic ideas, from the world, the polytheistic world of the Greeks and the Romans. It has a little bit of everything, all right? And so in some respects, it was very familiar to almost everyone within the Roman world. Jesus himself fit exactly the model of a hero in the ancient Greco-Roman world, all right? And this was something that was very common and very accepted to them. And so it was in so many ways familiar, and that most religious, those who observed religious rituals and embraced religious ideas and theological constructs could easily adopt Christianity. And that was the Roman ethos, right, is to adopt religious ideas. And Jesus is just another one of those religious or divine figures that the Romans would want to have on their sides, ultimately, after centuries of conflict. Okay? Now, you're going to hear probably a lot of this repeated on Friday, but just to sort of set the thing. So we're going to, the whole notions of the Trinity and omniscience and all of that sort of thing, these are all things. What we're really worried about at this point is, what did Jesus say? What did he do? And what does it mean for us as a community as we look at this? What does it mean for these communities that try to establish some sort of what does it mean to be a member of the Jesus movement? How are we supposed to organize ourselves? What are we supposed to do on a daily basis? What rituals are we supposed to, because that's what a religion is, right? It has a set of ideas, a set of concepts, and a set of rituals and behaviors that are associated with it. What are they? And how are we supposed to do that? And that's what Paul is working furiously to establish among these communities that he initiates and that he forms. Okay? I'm sorry for taking up so much time.
Oh, no, you're good.
To introduce this, Connor.
Can I ask a question about
Yeah.
Friday? Can
Yeah.
I go to the 11 o'clock?
Sure,
Okay.
sure. Just to say this, we're going to introduce this, and I introduced this for you, and the effort that you put into, and I appreciate the effort that you put into this exercise at the very beginning, is about, it gets us into some of the basic issues. That is, what is the Spirit? Okay? You can see, through your examination, that it is in some respects analogous to the Spirit that Seneca talks about, right? A spirit, an animating spirit that is consistent with the Stoic idea of the soul, right? The Epicureans are not going to, they understand that there's something that animates organic life, but they're not going to say that this is a separate thing that that exists. They're not going to, or they're not going to believe that it lives after death. We saw that Plato has the concept of the soul. All of these things in the writings that we are now we're now studying, the word pneuma is the word that they use most frequently in reference to this soul, the spirit, whatever it is, and pneuma literally means breath. And so trying to figure out what the holy pneuma is, that is this breath of God, of some sort of supernatural force, and its relationship to whatever animating spirit that we have that constitutes life as human life as we understand it, this is the very beginning of this debate of trying to figure out exactly what it is. When Jesus says that I'm going to send this pneuma, a Holy Spirit, and it's going to inhabit you, what does that mean? And the concept of enthusiasm, that is, of a divine force taking control or inhabiting one, we've just seen that, right? We've just seen that in the life of Dido and Turnus, right? The whole notion that a god can enter into a human being and cause, wholesale psychological change and even physical transformations. This is a very common idea. This is not anything new to us. We recognize and we understand that. Okay, so this is not anything strange or bizarre in this cultural context. But what is this? What spirit is it? And in fact, one of the big points of contention in the biographies of Jesus is whether this is a benign, beneficial pneuma, or whether it's a, evil, disastrous pneuma. Is it electo, okay, or is it amor, right? Or is it something else? And who controls it? And who gets to get it? And what is the mechanism for receiving this? How does it happen? What do we have to establish some sort of behaviors in order for this? Is there some sort of authority that conveys this? And baptism, what is baptism? The notion of a purification has been long practiced by the Hebrew people and the Jewish people. If you go to Jerusalem, for example, and you go to the main the temple area, you will see that there are dozens of basins and areas that contain water as part of the purification rituals associated with the rituals of the temple, the first and second temple. Ritual purification is absolutely a part of virtually every religious tradition that comes out of the Mediterranean Middle East, including Islam. Right? We have been doing this for millennia, but why is this form of purification by water? First of all, what is it? How does it work? Is it sprinkling? Is it immersion? What is it? Okay. What kind of water works? Who performs it? Under what circumstances? In other words, baptism has been around for millennia, but now there is this new kind of baptism, okay? And this new kind of holy pneuma. How does that work? And this whole notion about ingesting the body of this person. These are all concepts that people are trying to understand and trying to grasp. So, my apologies for taking up the time, but hopefully this will provide a foundation or a framework for our investigation, which will really get underway next Monday. Yeah.
Is the Olympic actually the same
Yes.
as the Olympic?
Yes. You need to let me know that you do that, so that
Okay, can I go to the Olympic?
you may go to the
Stop
11
sharing.
o'clock. Yes.
Right?
What's that?
How do I just click stop on the phone?
Just
Just
put
click
stop.